We received a message on the morning of October 14th, 2019, that would change the way I saw the Appalachian Mountains forever. It wasn't a typical alert from the local ranger station or an email from the hiking association. It was a simple, cryptic note sent by someone named Margaret Hensley, a resident of Boone, North Carolina, a town nestled at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The message read, "The mountains are waking. Come before the mist swallows the paths." At first, I dismissed it as a dramatic attempt to lure tourists into the autumn foliage. But something in her tone, an urgency that didn't feel artificial, made me pause. Boone had always seemed like a sleepy town, filled with craft shops and coffee houses, yet those mountains surrounding it carried a weight of stories, whispered for generations. Stories of the Vale of Echoes, a place where the air hums with voices of the past, where travelers vanish only to reappear days later, changed. My curiosity, stronger than caution, propelled me toward a journey that began on that crisp October morning, with the sun just breaking through a pale fog. I packed my camera, notebook, and an old compass that my grandfather had given me, a relic he said once belonged to his great-grandfather who had explored the same ridges in the 1920s. By noon, I was driving the winding roads past the town of Blowing Rock, the trees aflame with reds and golds, until I reached the start of the Appalachian Trail segment that led into the more remote parts of the mountains. The air grew cooler, and a sense of expectancy settled around me, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Local legend claimed that the Vale of Echoes appeared only under certain conditions, usually when the mist hung thick and low, and the wind carried sounds that were not from this world. Older residents spoke of travelers who had heard indistinct whispers calling their names, or footsteps echoing behind them when no one was there. Some claimed the phenomenon had been observed since the 1800s, though records were sparse and often dismissed as folklore. I found myself recalling one story Margaret had mentioned in her brief message. In 1876, a logger named Elias Whitmore reportedly disappeared near what is now called the Cranberry Ridge, only to return 3 days later with his eyes wide, muttering incoherent phrases about shadows speaking in the mist. Despite these eerie accounts, the mountains had always drawn people to them. Their dense forests, hidden waterfalls, and secluded ridges promised solitude and beauty, but always with an edge of the unknown. As I hiked, the path became narrower and more rugged, and the mist thickened around the trees, curling like ghostly fingers along the trail. I noted every sound, the crack of twigs underfoot, the distant cry of a hawk, even the gentle rustle of leaves. But then came something different. A whisper, faint and indistinct, seemed to drift from deeper within the forest. It wasn't threatening, but it carried a timbre of familiarity, as though the mountains themselves were attempting to speak directly to me. My pulse quickened, but I pressed forward, notebook open, jotting down every detail. Around 3:30 p.m., I reached an old stone bridge partially overgrown with moss, a landmark mentioned in local maps but rarely visited. The bridge arched over a narrow creek whose water ran a deep, clear blue. It was here that I first noticed the unusual patterns in the fog. It didn't just drift, but seemed to coil and spiral around the trunks of the trees, almost forming shapes that teased recognition. A face here, a hand there. I caught my reflection in the creek and noticed that the mist behind me seemed to shimmer, subtly moving, even when the wind was still. As I paused, I thought of Margaret's warning, before the mist swallows the paths. It was one thing to hear a story, another to witness the living essence of it. I had a camera in hand, but felt a strange hesitation. It was as if photographing the moment would somehow trap something not meant to be captured. The trail ahead climbed sharply toward the ridge line known as Whispering Peak, a name that now seemed more ominous than poetic. Every step echoed differently in the thick fog, and I began to question if the sounds I heard were entirely my own imagination. Shadows shifted along the trees, and for a brief instant, I felt eyes upon me from the mist, though turning revealed nothing. The old legends claimed that the Vale of Echoes could induce hallucinations, that time could dilate, and that those who ventured too far might glimpse fragments of events long past. I didn't know if I believed, but the mountains seemed to want me to. By late afternoon, the sun was low, and the fog began to take on a golden hue, diffusing the light into a surreal glow. It was then I heard it again, a whispering voice, clearer this time, but still unidentifiable. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling me, calling my name softly. Michael, Michael, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't told anyone my name had been Michael for decades. Everyone in the town knew me only by my nickname. This personal echo from the mist made my skin crawl, yet I couldn't turn back. Something about the mountains compelled me onward, toward a small grove that locals called the Hollow of Ancients, where supposedly, centuries ago, Native American tribes had performed rituals to honor the spirits of the mountains. There, under a cluster of twisted oaks and hickories, I found carvings in the bark, some old and worn, others seemingly fresh, depicting faces and symbols I could not decipher. The air vibrated subtly, not audibly but in the chest and bones, as if the mountain itself were alive with stories desperate to be told. I realized then that the message from Margaret had not been a prank or a cryptic poem. It was a summons. The mountains, with all their mystery, were awake that day, and I had stepped into their current, willingly, irresistibly. Little did I know, the journey was only beginning, and what awaited me at the ridge line would challenge every rational explanation I had ever held, forcing me to confront a legacy that stretched back centuries, intertwined with the very essence of the Blue Ridge themselves, and with echoes of the past that refused to remain silent. As I ascended the upper reaches of Whispering Peak on the night of October 14th, 2019, the mist thickened into an almost tangible curtain, clinging to my clothes and seeping into my senses. The moon, partially obscured by ragged clouds, cast pale, uneven light across jagged rocks and twisted trees, making shadows dance like living things. The air was colder now, sharp against my skin, and every footfall echoed loudly, though no one else was there. I could feel the mountain itself observing me, not with malice, but with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Then it happened. The mist began to shift in patterns so precise it was as if it were responding to my very presence. Shapes emerged, arches of fog forming corridors, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished the moment I blinked. I realized with a mix of awe and fear that I had entered a space where the physical and the ethereal overlapped, where the echoes of the past manifested in ways that defied explanation. At the narrowest point of the ridge, known locally as the Spine, the wind howled through natural rock formations, producing tones that resembled distant choral voices. The whispering I had heard all afternoon intensified, layering into a complex harmony of individual voices, recounting fragments of their lives: miners, loggers, settlers, children playing near hidden streams, all somehow woven together in the mountain's memory. My pulse quickened. I stumbled over a root and caught myself on a moss-covered rock, my eyes scanning the fog, trying to make sense of the shifting silhouettes. That's when I saw her, a woman standing motionless a few yards ahead, half hidden by the mist. She was dressed in garments that suggested a time long past, pale in the moonlight, her expression unreadable. I called out, "Hello," but my voice seemed swallowed by the fog. She raised a hand slowly, almost beckoning me forward, then stepped backward, disappearing into a swirl of mist that left a faint trail of luminescence. My rational mind told me it could not be real, yet every instinct screamed otherwise. Heart racing, I pressed forward, compelled to follow, and the mist seemed to guide me along the ridge. Then the ground beneath me trembled subtly, the ridge resonating like a living thing. I paused, breathing heavily, and realized that the mountain itself was vibrating, an almost imperceptible rhythm that synced with the chorus of voices around me. Shadows flickered along the edges of my vision, some human-shaped, some strange, unidentifiable, yet none hostile. The mountain was alive with the echoes of history, and I was standing at its very heart. At the crest of the ridge, I encountered a circle of stones unlike any I had seen before. They were ancient, irregular in shape, yet arranged with a precision that suggested deliberate purpose. The mist swirled around them in patterns that hinted at symbols, some of which matched the carvings I had seen in the Hollow of Ancients. The whispers now converged, forming phrases I could comprehend. Observe, remember, carry the story. I reached out to touch one of the stones, and immediately, a wave of sensation washed over me. Visions, fleeting and intense. I saw the ridge as it had been centuries ago, travelers passing through, children laughing, storms raging, rituals performed to honor the mountain's spirit. I felt joy, fear, sorrow, and awe all at once, as if the memories of generations were flooding through me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the weight of centuries. The mist thickened further, forming arches and tunnels of light that pulsed rhythmically. From somewhere deep within the fog came a single, clear voice. "You are chosen to see, not to disturb." The clarity of the message struck me, and I understood that my presence here was not a mere accident. The mountain had called me, tested me, and now revealed a fraction of its secret. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. I could not tell. The physical world seemed suspended, time stretching and folding in ways that left me disoriented. The luminous shapes began to coalesce into a single form, a figure that resembled a guardian of the ridge, its features blurred but exuding an unmistakable sense of authority and calm. It extended an arm, pointing toward the path that led back to the lower slopes, and I instinctively followed, as though compelled by invisible guidance. With each step down, the mist gradually thinned, the shadows retreated, and the eerie chorus faded into distant echoes, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees. I paused once more, looking back at the summit, and for a fleeting moment, I swore the ridge itself seemed to bow slightly, a silent acknowledgement of my passage. By the time I reached the lower trailhead near Boone, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the mountains in soft amber light. I was physically exhausted, yet my mind was ablaze with everything I had witnessed: the whispers, the visions, the guiding presence of the mountain itself. I knew that what I had experienced could not be shared lightly, that words could only convey a fraction of the truth, and yet I felt compelled to record it, to honor the memory and the stories of those who had come before. The ridge, the mist, the echoes, they were all part of a living archive, a sacred memory of the Blue Ridge, and I had been allowed a glimpse. Something had shifted inside me during those hours, a profound awareness that the mountains hold histories far deeper than any written record. I understood now that the legends of Whispering Peak were not mere tales told to thrill or frighten travelers. They were warnings, invitations, and testimonies of an existence layered over time. And though the mountain had released me back into the waking world, the echoes of the night clung to me, lingering in my thoughts, in the rustle of leaves, and in the way the wind seemed to carry voices long after I had descended. By the time I returned to Boone on the morning of October 15th, 2019, the town was waking under a crisp, golden sun, entirely ordinary to anyone who had not witnessed what I had. Yet I carried with me a heaviness, an awareness that the mountains held secrets far beyond human comprehension. The first thing I noticed was that my notebook, filled with frantic observations and sketches from the ridge, now included markings I had not made, symbols etched in the margins, spiraling in patterns that mirrored the formations I had seen in the mist. At first, I panicked, thinking I had lost control of my mind, but the calm that had accompanied the guiding figure on the ridge now filled me, grounding me in understanding rather than fear. I tried to recount my journey to Margaret Hensley, who had first sent the cryptic message. When I found her at her small cabin on the edge of town, she listened silently as I spoke, nodding occasionally, her eyes reflecting something I had not expected: recognition. "You saw it then," she said quietly, almost to herself. "The veil chooses whom to show itself. Few ever do." She told me that the stories I had encountered, the carvings, the Hollow of Ancients, the Gathering Stones, were all part of a network of sites where the mountains themselves had preserved memory, passing knowledge and warnings across generations. Some local historians had dismissed these sites as folklore, yet Margaret insisted the accounts were consistent. Those who experienced the mountain's whispers often returned profoundly changed, carrying an unspoken responsibility to remember and honor the echoes they had encountered. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in my perception. Sounds seemed more layered. The wind carried voices faintly in the distance, and the fog in the lower valleys occasionally swirled into patterns reminiscent of those I had seen on Whispering Peak. At night, I sometimes dreamt of the ridge, the stone circle, and the luminous forms, not as nightmares, but as invitations, reminders that the mountain's story was ongoing, and that I had become part of it. Over the months, I returned to document the ridge carefully, photographing what could be photographed, sketching symbols, and noting patterns in the mist, yet I never encountered the same intensity of whispers again. I understood that the mountain revealed itself selectively, and that my first passage had been a rare convergence of timing, spirit, and presence. The legend of Whispering Peak, once a collection of eerie tales, had now intertwined with my own life. I came to realize that these mountains were not simply landscapes to traverse. They were living repositories, guardians of history and memory, demanding respect and mindfulness. Visitors who approached casually would see only the beauty of the forest, the crisp air, the fall colors, and perhaps the occasional fog. But those attuned, those who approached with openness and humility, might hear the faintest echoes of the past, as I had. I kept Margaret's message, rereading it often. The mountains are waking. Come before the mist swallows the paths. I finally understood it as both a warning and a gift. And though my story has been met with skepticism by some, I remain certain of what I experienced. The Blue Ridge Mountains, with their hidden ridges, mist-laden paths, and whispered memories, are alive with stories that span centuries. Those who venture into them may encounter only solitude and scenic vistas, or, if the mountain wills it, they may hear voices carried through time, guiding, observing, and reminding us that some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than explained. I now walk the trails with a reverent awareness, attuned to the slightest change in the mist, the subtle rhythm of wind through trees, and the ever-present possibility that the mountain might call again. And when it does, I know that I, and those who follow, will hear the echoes and carry them forward.